The rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof of their tiny house, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the gnawing anxiety in Jalen's gut. Each drop was a tiny, icy finger tapping on his conscience, reminding him of the overdue electricity bill crumpled in his mama's hand. It wasn't a loud reminder, not like the shouting matches from Mrs. Henderson next door, but it was a constant, insistent pressure that made his chest tight. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around him, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that seeped deeper than his skin. Mon, Georgia, wasn't much of a town, but on a Friday afternoon like this, it felt like the edge of the world, desolate and unforgiving. The plastic grocery bag crinkled in his hand. It clinked with every step. Soda cans, beer bottles, anything worth a few cents at the recycling center. He wasn't looking for glory, just enough to help Mama cover the light bill this month. Maybe, just maybe, enough for a small bag of those sweet potato fries she liked. He kicked a loose pebble down the cracked sidewalk, watching its erratic journey, a tiny metaphor for his own uncertain path. 12 years old shouldn't feel this heavy. He swallowed hard, pushing down the knot of responsibility that threatened to choke him. It was a familiar weight, one he carried with a stoicism that belied his age. The air hung heavy, saturated with the smell of wet asphalt and the faint, metallic tang of rain on rusting metal. Jalen hunched his shoulders, the dampness clinging to his threadbare clothes. He scanned the gutters, his eyes trained to spot the glint of discarded aluminum, the telltale shape of a forgotten glass bottle. Each find was a small victory, a tiny piece of the puzzle that was their survival. He knew Mama wouldn't ask him to do this. She'd say it was a grown-up problem, that he should be focusing on school, on being a kid. But the lines around her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them anymore, told a different story. A story of silent sacrifices, of burdens carried alone. And Jalen, in his quiet, observant way, had learned to read those lines, to understand the unspoken language of their shared struggle. He turned down Elm Street, a shortcut through the deserted industrial district. The buildings here stood like hollowed-out skeletons, their windows dark and vacant, staring down at him with an unnerving intensity. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic tattoo on the metal roofs. A gust of wind whipped around the corner, sending a shiver down his spine. He tugged his hood lower, trying to shield his face from the biting wind and the driving rain. Even the stray dogs, usually bold scavengers of these streets, had sought shelter from the downpour. Suddenly, a sound sliced through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. A sharp, choke cry, followed by a muffled thud. Jalen froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clutched the plastic bag tighter, his knuckles turning white. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped him. His first instinct was to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the rain-swept streets. But the cry, the raw terror in it, held him rooted to the spot. It resonated with a primal fear, a vulnerability he recognized. He peered cautiously around the corner of a dilapidated warehouse. Two figures, shrouded in black hoodies, were hunched over a third figure on the ground. The scene was obscured by the driving rain, but even from this distance, Jalen could sense the violence unfolding. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a sinister energy that made his stomach churn. He recognized the expensive handbag, the tailored suit, even beneath the mud and the rain. It was Mrs. Siver, the former CEO of Clearwave Technologies, the woman whose face had graced magazine covers, whose name had been whispered in hushed tones of awe and envy. Now, she lay crumpled on the ground, her body convulsing, a whimper escaping her lips. Jalen's mind raced. He knew he should run, that getting involved was dangerous, foolish even. But the image of his mama, her tired eyes, her weary smile, flashed through his mind. He thought of the electricity bill, the small bag of sweet potato fries. He thought of the quiet dignity with which she bore her burdens, the unspoken promise in her eyes to protect him, to shield him from the harsh realities of their life. And in that moment, a strange, unfamiliar courage bloomed within him. He couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. It was simply there, a visceral reaction, a primal instinct to protect, to defend. He picked up a loose brick from the rubble at his feet, his hand trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and stepped out into the rain. The air in the alley reeked of stale detergent and something faintly metallic, a scent that prickled Jalen's nose and made him wrinkle it involuntarily. Friday afternoons were usually his most productive scavenging time. The laundromat, closed and dark, cast long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the grimy brick walls. He usually felt a strange comfort in these desolate spaces, a sense of being unseen, unnoticed, just another shadow blending into the urban decay. Today, however, a different kind of unease tightened his chest. A low, guttural sound, like a wounded animal, echoed from the deeper recesses of the alley. Jalen froze, one hand clutching the bulging sack of plastic bottles slung over his shoulder. His instinct, honed by years of navigating the city's underbelly, screamed at him to retreat, to melt back into the anonymity of the street. He told himself it was none of his business, just another fight, another rumble in the concrete jungle. He'd seen enough of them, heard enough screams echoing off the indifferent brick facades to last a lifetime. He learned early on that the best way to survive was to be invisible. The sound came again, sharper this time, followed by a muffled thud and a man's harsh, grating voice. Jalen's heart hammered against his ribs. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the plastic bottles rustling like dry leaves in the deepening twilight. He knew he should leave. His mama would be worried. She'd told him 100 times, "Jalen, mind your own. Trouble ain't never brought nothing but more trouble." He imagined her face, etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The weight of her struggles pressed down on him, a constant reminder of his own responsibility. He needed to bring home those bottles. Every penny counted. Yet, the woman's cry, laced with a raw terror he'd never heard before, resonated within him, a discordant note that refused to be silenced. He crept closer, hugging the wall, his sneakers squeaking on the damp pavement. His breath hitched in his throat as he peered around a stack of discarded cardboard boxes. Two figures, dark and indistinct in the fading light, loomed over a third, smaller one. They were dressed in black hoodies, their faces obscured by shadows. The smaller figure thrashed and whimpered, her voice choked with fear. A wave of nausea washed over Jalen. He wanted to turn away, to run back the way he came and pretend he'd seen nothing. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, the woman's terrified cries echoing in his ears. He thought of his mama, her strength, her unwavering belief in doing what was right, even when it was hard. He opened his eyes again, the scene in front of him blurring through a film of unshed tears. "Get off me, please." The woman's voice was weak, a threadbare plea in the gathering darkness. Jalen saw a flash of something metallic, a glint of silver in one of the men's hands. His stomach lurched. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he couldn't just stand there and watch. He scanned the alley, his eyes darting from one object to another, searching for something, anything, that he could use. His gaze landed on a loose brick lying near an overflowing dumpster. He snatched it up, his small hand closing tightly around its rough surface. It was heavy, solid, a tangible weight against the intangible fear that threatened to paralyze him. He took a deep breath, the metallic tang of the alley filling his lungs. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew he was probably making a mistake, a huge, life-altering mistake, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He wouldn't. He stepped out from behind the boxes, the brick held high above his head. His voice, thin and reedy, cracked as he yelled, "Hey, leave her alone." The two men froze, momentarily startled by his sudden appearance. They turned towards him, their faces now partially visible in the dim light. Hard, unforgiving eyes stared back at him, eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. "This ain't your business, kid," one of them snarled, his voice thick with menace. Jalen's grip tightened on the brick. He knew he was outmatched, outnumbered, but a strange calmness settled over him, a quiet resolve that surprised even himself. He wasn't sure where it came from, this sudden surge of courage, but it was there, a steady flame flickering in the darkness. The other man stepped forward, his shadow looming over Jalen like a predatory bird. "You think we don't know who you are?" he sneered, his words dripping with a chilling familiarity. He turned back to the woman, his voice laced with venom. "Margot!" The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jalen felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why, but the name resonated with him, a faint echo of something half-forgotten, a whisper from a past he couldn't quite grasp. He looked at the woman, her face bruised and bloodied, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked almost like recognition. The metallic smell in the air seemed to intensify, now sharp and acrid, like the scent of blood. The alley, once a haven of anonymity, suddenly felt charged with a hidden history, a story waiting to be told. The brick felt surprisingly heavy in Jalen's small hand. He hadn't meant to pick it up, not really. It had just been there, a jagged piece of the city's broken promises, lying discarded next to the overflowing dumpster. He usually just sorted through the trash, looking for redeemable scraps, anything to lessen the weight on his mama's shoulders. But the screams, raw and filled with the terror he recognized from too many late-night arguments echoing through thin apartment walls, had frozen him. He'd looked up, seen the struggle, the glint of something metallic in the attacker's hand, and his breath had hitched in his throat. He knew that look, the desperate, hunted expression in the woman's eyes. He'd seen it reflected in his own mother's face more times than he cared to remember. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He knew he should run, should disappear back into the shadows the way he always did. He was just a kid, small and insignificant, a ghost in this alleyway of discarded lives. What would he possibly do? But the woman's choked gasp, the way her body crumpled against the brick wall, ignited a flicker of defiance within him. He couldn't explain it, this sudden surge of reckless courage. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather, a man he barely knew but whose stories of standing up for what's right echoed in his mind. Maybe it was simply the primal instinct to protect the vulnerable, a feeling deeply ingrained in him despite his own vulnerability. His grip tightened around the brick, the rough surface scraping against his skin, a tangible reminder of the reality unfolding before him. He hesitated, a war waging within him. Fear whispered insidious warnings, painting vivid pictures of the consequences of his interference. But another voice, quieter yet more persistent, urged him forward, reminding him of the woman's terror, the silent plea in her wide, frightened eyes. He took a shaky breath, the stench of rotting garbage filling his lungs, and aimed. He hadn't intended to hit anyone. Not really. He just wanted to create a distraction, a momentary break in the violence. But the brick, propelled by a desperate surge of adrenaline, flew through the air with unexpected force, striking the attacker's shoulder with a sickening thud. The man yelped, a sound of surprised pain, and stumbled back, his grip on the woman loosening. For a fleeting second, the alley fell silent, the only sound the woman's ragged breaths. Jalen's own heart pounded in his ears, a deafening drumbeat against the sudden quiet. He saw the attacker's eyes, dark and filled with rage, shift towards him. A jolt of fear shot through him, cold and paralyzing. He had traded one victim for another. He was the target now. "Hey!" His voice cracked, barely audible above the rushing in his ears. He surprised himself. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words tumbled out, a desperate plea for action, for escape. "Come on, run." He reached for the woman, his hand trembling as he pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs weak beneath her, and he had to support her weight, his small frame straining under the burden. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, met his. He saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of gratitude in their depths, and a strange sense of connection, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability, passed between them. They ran, a clumsy, desperate flight through the labyrinthine alleyways. The shouts of the attackers echoed behind them, a chilling reminder of the danger that still lurked close. Jalen's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running, driven by a primal fear he couldn't quite comprehend. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away, had to escape the shadows that clung to them like a second skin. The woman stumbled again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He tightened his grip on her arm, urging her forward. He could hear the pounding footsteps of their pursuers growing closer, the sound echoing off the brick walls, closing in on them. He glanced back, his heart seizing in his chest. The two men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoodies, were gaining on them. They reached a narrow passage, barely wide enough for one person. He pushed the woman ahead of him, urging her to squeeze through. He followed close behind, his body scraping against the rough brick walls. The passage opened onto a busy street, the noise and chaos a stark contrast to the silent terror of the alleyway. They emerged blinking into the bright sunlight, disoriented and breathless. He looked back, but the alleyway was empty. The attackers were gone, swallowed by the shadows. He turned to the woman, his breath catching in his throat. Her face, pale and streaked with dirt, was etched with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else there too, something he couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the relief of survival, the fragile peace that comes after escaping the clutches of darkness. He didn't know, not really. He was just a kid, after all. But he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his bones, that he had done something important, something that mattered. He had saved a life, and in doing so, he had perhaps saved a part of himself as well. The rusty, corrugated iron of the auto garage radiated the afternoon heat, its metallic scent mingling with the acrid tang of motor oil and decaying leaves. Jalen pressed his back against the cool dampness of the brick wall, his chest heaving. The narrow alley, choked with discarded tires and broken furniture, offered a precarious sanctuary. Margot, slumped against a stack of oil drums, cradled her injured ankle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She closed her eyes, the image of the men's boots, their brutal efficiency, still flashing behind her eyelids. They wanted me dead. The thought clawed at her composure, a cold dread seeping into her bones. But why? Why so violent? Jalen watched her, his small frame tense. He'd never seen such raw fear in anyone's eyes, a terror that echoed something deep within him, a familiar shadow from his own life's hardships. He clutched the brick in his hand, the rough texture a tangible reminder of his impulsive act. I could have been hurt, he thought, the adrenaline slowly receding, replaced by a tremor of fear. They could have hurt Mama. Yet another part of him, a quiet, insistent voice, whispered, you had to do something. You couldn't just stand there. He shifted uncomfortably, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. He glanced at Margot's ankle, now swelling rapidly, the skin a mottled purple. A small, dark stain blossomed on her expensive silk trousers. Blood, he realized, his stomach clenching. He'd seen blood before, scraped knees in playground fights, but this was different, darker, more ominous. I can't. Margot's voice, a choked whisper, broke the silence. She tried to shift her weight, a grimace of pain twisting her features. My ankle, Jalen swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to help, to say something reassuring, but words seemed to evade him. He'd never been good with words, preferring the quiet refuge of his own thoughts. Margot looked at him, then really looked at him for the first time. The fear in her eyes hadn't completely dissipated, but a new emotion, a flicker of bewilderment, was taking its place. You're a kid, she murmured, her voice laced with disbelief. Jalen's cheeks flushed. He felt a sudden urge to disappear, to melt back into the shadows of the alley. Being noticed, being seen, was a discomfort he'd learned to avoid. He lowered his gaze, focusing on the worn-out soles of his sneakers. She's right, he thought. What was I thinking? I'm just a kid. I can't save anyone. Margot's mind raced, trying to reconcile the brutal attack with the image of this small, thin boy who had, inexplicably, intervened. A child, she thought, a wave of dizziness washing over her. He saved me. He risked his life for me. A stranger. A child. The absurdity of it struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her world, once built on calculated risks and strategic maneuvers, had been reduced to this, hiding in a dirty alley, relying on the bravery of a 12-year-old. The silence stretched, punctuated only by Margot's shallow breaths and the distant rumble of city traffic. The air, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and dust, seemed to press down on them, suffocating. Jalen looked up, his gaze drawn to the darkening sky. The afternoon sun was already sinking behind the buildings, casting long, distorted shadows across the alley. Mama will be worried, he thought, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. I need to get home. But he couldn't just leave her. Not like this. He looked back at Margot, her face pale, her eyes closed. She seemed fragile, broken. A sudden, fierce protectiveness surged within him, a feeling he hadn't recognized before. She needs help, he thought. I need to help her. He took a hesitant step towards her, the brick still clutched tightly in his hand. Are you okay? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow in the face of her pain. Margot opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. The fear was still there, but something else had shifted, a subtle softening in her expression. No, she admitted, her voice weak. I'm not okay. She closed her eyes again, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. I need a doctor, she thought. I need to get out of here. But where could she go? Who could she trust? Her life, once a carefully constructed facade of success and power, had crumbled around her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The only person she could turn to was this boy, this unlikely savior who had appeared out of nowhere, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. And in that moment, surrounded by the grime and decay of the alley, a strange, unsettling sense of connection began to form between them, forged in the crucible of fear and shared vulnerability. A bond that would change both their lives forever. The alley reeked of stale beer and something faintly sweet like rotting fruit. Jalen's stomach churned, a familiar pang of hunger mixed with the lingering nausea from the violence he'd witnessed. The brick felt heavy in his pocket, a cold, hard reminder of the force he'd used, a force he hadn't known he possessed. He glanced at the woman, Margot. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. A thin line of blood trickled from her forehead, a stark contrast against the pale skin of her face. He wanted to run, to disappear back into the familiar shadows of his neighborhood, but his feet were rooted to the spot. What if she dies? The thought clawed at his throat, a sudden, suffocating fear. He wasn't sure why he cared. He didn't know her, but the image of her crumpled body, the way her eyes had widened in terror, was seared into his mind. He swallowed hard, trying to dislodge the knot of anxiety. You got a phone? Margot's voice was weak, barely a whisper. Jalen flinched. He'd almost forgotten she was there. He shook his head. Phones were a luxury his family couldn't afford. He patted his pockets, feeling the crumpled bills, the meager earnings from his day's scavenging. Enough for some bread, maybe some milk. Definitely not a phone. Okay, she mumbled, her eyes fluttering closed. I know a payphone. Jalen watched her struggle to sit up, her face contorted in pain. He hesitated. He should help her, he knew, but there was a war raging inside him. On one side, a deep-seated distrust of strangers, a survival instinct honed by years of hardship. On the other, a flicker of empathy, a nascent sense of responsibility. She needs help. You saw what happened. You have to help. The thought pulsed in his mind, an insistent drumbeat against the wall of his fear. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm. He pulled back. What if those men come back? He scanned the alley, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The silence was thick, oppressive. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. Gently, he helped Margot to her feet. Her body was lighter than he expected, fragile. She leaned heavily on him, her hand gripping his shoulder with surprising strength. He felt the tremor in her body, the raw vulnerability. He averted his gaze, focusing on the task at hand. Just get her to the phone. Then you can leave. He repeated the mantra in his head, trying to convince himself. The walk to the payphone felt like an eternity. Every creak, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figures of her attackers emerge from the darkness. Margot stumbled several times, her breath coming in gasps. He tightened his grip on her arm, silently urging her forward. The payphone was a beacon of faded yellow in the deepening twilight. Jalen felt a surge of relief. He helped Margot settle onto the small, metal shelf beneath the phone. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers trembling, and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Her hand shook as she unfolded it, revealing a series of numbers scrawled in shaky handwriting. Jalen watched as she dialed, her movements slow and deliberate. He listened to the ringing tone, each ring echoing in the quiet street, amplifying the tension. Finally, a voice answered. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the subtle shift in Margot's expression, the way her shoulders slumped, the gradual release of tension in her face. Relief washed over him, a wave of exhaustion following close behind. He'd done it. He'd helped her. The arrival of the emergency services was a blur of flashing lights and hurried voices. Paramedics swarmed around Margot, their questions sharp and efficient. He watched as they examined her wounds, their faces grim. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he were watching a scene unfold on a television screen. He was still clutching the brick in his pocket, the rough surface a grounding presence in the midst of the chaos. A police officer approached him, his expression stern. "You called 911?" he asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Jalen nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The officer asked him a series of questions, his tone softening as Jalen recounted the events. He felt a strange sense of pride, mixed with unease. He'd never interacted with the police before, not like this. As Margot was loaded into the ambulance, her eyes met his. For a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of something akin to gratitude. Then the doors closed, and the ambulance sped away, leaving Jalen standing alone under the flickering streetlight, the silence of the alley broken only by the distant wail of a siren. He felt drained, emptied of all emotion. He looked down at the brick in his hand, turning it over and over. It was just a brick, a piece of rubble. But in that moment, it felt like something more. It was a symbol of his unexpected courage, a tangible reminder of the night he stepped out of the shadows and into the unknown. The night he saved a life. The night his life, he suspected, began to change. The weak morning light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up window, painting stripes across Jalen's worn blanket. He lay still, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind like a flickering film reel. The woman's face, etched with fear and pain, the glint of the streetlight on the wet asphalt. The sickening thud of the brick. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to erase the images, but they clung to the edges of his consciousness. He hadn't told Mama. He knew she'd worry, her brow furrowing deeper than the lines already etched there by years of hardship. What good would it do anyway? It was over. He'd done what he could. Or had he? A prickle of unease settled in his stomach. He'd run. He hadn't stayed to see if she was all right. The aroma of frying bacon, faint but persistent, finally drew him out of bed. He padded into the small kitchen, the linoleum cold against his bare feet. Mama hummed a low tune as she flipped the bacon, her back to him. The rhythmic sizzle and pop were the soundtrack to their mornings, a familiar comfort in their often uncertain world. He sat at the wobbly table, the plastic surface cool beneath his forearms. He picked at a loose splinter, avoiding his mother's gaze. "Sleep all right, baby?" she asked, her voice soft, a hint of weariness clinging to the edges. "Yeah, Ma," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in the formica. He could feel her eyes on him, questioning, probing. He knew she sensed his withdrawal, the unusual quietness that had settled over him like a shroud. He usually chattered about the things he found on his scavenging routes, a discarded toy car, a colorful button, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil. Today, silence hung heavy in the air between them. The small, flickering television in the corner suddenly blared to life, spitting static before settling on a local news channel. The anchor's polished voice cut through the quiet. Margot Siver, the former CEO of Clearwave Technologies. Jalen's head snapped up. The woman. The one he'd helped. Her face, bruised and bloodied, flashed across the screen. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, tightening his chest. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. Facing multiple allegations of corporate fraud. Whereabouts unknown until last night's incident. The news report continued, detailing the alleged attack, the police investigation, the ongoing search. Jalen's mind raced. Corporate fraud? Attack? What did it all mean? He glanced at his mother, who was staring at the television, her expression a mixture of disbelief and morbid fascination. He saw the questions forming in her eyes, mirroring his own confusion. Something happened at the center yesterday, his mother murmured, more to herself than to him. Near where you usually, her voice trailed off, her gaze shifting to him, a flicker of understanding dawning in her eyes. Jalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. He opened his mouth to speak, to confess, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He swallowed hard, the lump of fear and guilt refusing to budge. How could he tell her what he'd witnessed? How could he explain his involvement, his fear, his flight? He saw the woman's face again, this time clearer, sharper, no longer just a victim, but a person, a powerful figure fallen from grace. Margot Siver. The name echoed in his mind, a strange dissonance against the image of her vulnerability, her desperation. He thought of the expensive clothes she wore, torn and stained, a stark contrast to his own patched-up hand-me-downs. He thought of the fear in her eyes, the same fear he felt every day navigating the harsh realities of their neighborhood. He looked at his mother, her face etched with worry. He knew she deserved the truth, but the words remained trapped, a jumbled mess of fear and guilt. The weight of the secret pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He pushed his plate away, the half-eaten bacon suddenly tasteless. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the small, quiet kitchen. "I gotta go," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. He needed air, space, time to process the swirling chaos in his mind. He needed to escape the confines of their tiny apartment, the suffocating weight of the secret he carried. "Jalen," his mother's voice was laced with concern. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, the cool metal a stark contrast to the burning shame that coursed through him. "I'll be back, Ma," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He slipped out the door, leaving the flickering television and his mother's worried gaze behind. The morning air was crisp and cool against his face, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the apartment. He walked aimlessly, his mind replaying the events of the night, the news report, his mother's questioning eyes. Margot Siver. The name, now attached to a face, a story, a scandal, echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the secret he carried, the weight of his unspoken truth. The world, once familiar and predictable, now felt tilted, off balance. The encounter had shifted something within him, something he couldn't yet understand, something that both terrified and compelled him. He walked on, lost in the labyrinth of his thoughts, the city streets stretching before him, a concrete jungle mirroring the turmoil within. The chipped porcelain sink, stained the color of weak tea, reflected a sliver of Saturday morning sun. Jalen ran a finger over a jagged crack, tracing its path like a river through a parched land. He'd always been fascinated by how things broke, how something whole could shatter into so many pieces, yet each shard still held the ghost of its former shape. He heard a hesitant knock, a polite intrusion into the fragile quiet of their small apartment. His stomach clenched. Visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. He felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, a touch both protective and uncertain. Her palm, calloused from years of scrubbing floors and folding laundry, felt warm against his thin shirt. "I'll get it, Jalen," she said, her voice soft but laced with a tension he recognized. It was the same tone she used when the landlord came by, or when an electricity bill arrived, a thick white envelope pregnant with bad news. He watched her open the door, her frame blocking the visitor from view. He heard a murmured exchange, the visitor's voice low and respectful, his mother's laced with a cautious curiosity. He strained to hear, his heart beating a quick, nervous rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't the landlord. This wasn't a debt collector. This voice was different. "Miss Margot Siver asked me to come personally," the voice said, and a ripple of recognition ran down Jalen's spine. The name echoed in the small space, bouncing off the bare walls and settling into the cracks of his memory. Margot Siver, the woman from the alley, the woman he'd helped. His mother stepped aside, revealing a man in a dark suit, his face kind but professional. He held a small, official-looking envelope in his gloved hand. He looked at Jalen, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Sympathy? Pity? Jalen couldn't decipher it. "She'd like to speak with your son, Jalen," the man continued, his voice gentle. "If it's all right with you, ma'am." His mother turned to him, her eyebrows furrowed in a worried frown. He knew what she was thinking. This woman, this wealthy stranger from a world they couldn't comprehend, what could she possibly want with her son? What connection could they possibly have? Her silence stretched, heavy and thick with unspoken fears. He felt a surge of defiance, a flicker of the same courage that had driven him to act in the alley. He didn't know why Margot Siver wanted to see him, but he knew he needed to go. He had questions that scratched at the inside of his skull, demanding answers. "It's okay, Mama," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I want to go." His mother's gaze searched his face, her eyes probing for any sign of fear or hesitation. He met her gaze, holding her stare with a newfound determination. He saw the worry slowly give way to a reluctant acceptance, the understanding that something had shifted, something had changed between them in that alley, in that single act of defiance. "All right, Jalen," she sighed, her voice resigned. She turned to the man. "We'll be ready in a few minutes." The man nodded and stepped back, allowing them a moment of privacy. The door closed softly behind him, leaving them alone in the quiet hum of their small apartment. The silence now felt different, charged with anticipation and a faint undercurrent of fear. Jalen's heart hammered in his chest as he followed his mother into their small bedroom. She helped him change into his cleanest clothes, the threadbare fabric soft against his skin. Her hands moved mechanically, her thoughts a swirling vortex of apprehension and bewilderment. "Be careful, Jalen," she whispered, her voice thick with unspoken anxieties. "Don't say anything you'll regret." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't understand her fear, but he felt its weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't know what awaited him at the hospital, but he sensed that it was more than a simple thank you. This encounter felt like a turning point, a crack in the mundane reality of his life, revealing a glimpse of something vast and unknown. The car ride was a blur. The city lights flashed by, a chaotic tapestry of light and shadow. Jalen sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, his mind replaying the events of that night. The alley, the attackers, Margot Siver's terrified face. The brick. He still couldn't quite believe he had done it. He had always been small, quiet, invisible. But in that moment, he had been something more. He had been brave. The hospital loomed before them, a stark white structure against the gray sky. The man in the suit led him through sterile corridors, the air thick with the antiseptic smell of disinfectant. Each step felt heavy, each breath a struggle. He was entering a world he didn't understand, a world of privilege and power, a world that felt impossibly far removed from his own. He stopped before a closed door, the polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The man knocked softly, and a voice from within granted them entry. He pushed the door open, and Jalen stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his ears. Margot Siver lay in the hospital bed, pale and fragile, but her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, held a spark of recognition. She smiled weakly, a faint curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. The room was filled with the hushed hum of medical equipment, the steady beep of a heart monitor a constant reminder of her vulnerability. "Jalen," she whispered, her voice raspy but clear. "Thank you for coming." He stood there, frozen in the doorway, the words caught in his throat. He wanted to ask her why. Why him? Why had he risked everything for a stranger? Why did she want to see him now? But the questions remained trapped within the cage of his ribs, unable to find their way out. He just stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and apprehension. He had saved her life, and now he had the unsettling feeling that she was about to change his. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood that had clung to Jalen just hours ago. He sat perched on the edge of the stiff hospital chair, the plastic digging into the backs of his thighs. His hands, usually grimy from scavenging, were scrubbed clean, almost unfamiliarly smooth. He stared at them, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a dull thrum against the quiet murmur of the nurses in the hallway. His mind kept replaying the scene, the glint of metal, the woman's scream, the thud of the brick against flesh. He hadn't meant to be a hero. He just reacted. Now, here he was, in a place he'd only ever seen on TV, sitting beside a woman he'd saved, a woman who looked at him with an intensity that made the hairs on his arms prickle. Margot Siver lay in the crisp white bed, her face pale against the stark linen, a network of bandages crisscrossing her forehead. Her eyes, though, were alert, burning with an unsettling mixture of gratitude and something that flickered like a candle flame in a draft, threatening to be extinguished at any moment. Jalen shifted uncomfortably, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the monotonous rhythm of the machines. He'd never been good with silence. It always felt thick, suffocating, like being trapped under a heavy blanket. You saved my life." Margot's voice was a rasp, barely a whisper, but it cut through the quiet. Jalen ducked his head, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on his worn jeans. "It wasn't nothing," he mumbled, the words catching in his throat. He could feel her gaze on him, intense, probing. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the sterile walls of the hospital room. He wasn't used to being seen, not really. He was a shadow, a ghost navigating the alleys and back streets, unseen, unheard. A long sigh escaped Margot's lips, a sound laden with weariness. "You remind me of someone," she said, her voice distant, as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. Jalen risked a glance, saw her eyes fixed on the ceiling, a faraway look in their depths. A long time ago, he held his breath, waiting. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension. He could feel a story unfolding, a story that seemed to reach out and touch him, even though he didn't know why. "When I was about your age," Margot's voice trailed off, the words catching her throat. She closed her eyes, a flicker of pain crossing her face. Jalen watched her, his curiosity warring with his inherent shyness. He'd always been a good listener, eavesdropping on snippets of conversations in the crowded streets, piecing together fragmented narratives in his mind. He knew how to read between the lines, how to decipher the unspoken language of gestures and expressions. "I was homeless," she finally continued, the word a raw, exposed nerve. Jalen's eyes widened. He knew homelessness. He'd seen it etched on the faces of the men and women huddled in doorways, their eyes hollow, their bodies thin and brittle. He'd never imagined this woman who wore expensive clothes and spoke with an air of authority, had ever been one of them. "My mother," Margot's voice broke. She swallowed hard, the movement of her throat visible beneath the thin hospital gown. "She was sick. We lived on the streets, scavenging for food, sleeping wherever we could find shelter." Her eyes opened, focusing on Jalen, a strange intensity in their depths. "It was cold. Winter. Chicago winters are brutal." Jalen nodded, a shiver running down his spine, even in the warmth of the hospital room. He knew the bite of winter, the way it seeped into your bones, leaving you aching and numb. One day, Margot continued, her voice gaining strength. "We were at a shelter, Tinsley Shelter. 1994. It was freezing, and we only had thin blankets. My mother was shivering uncontrollably. I was terrified she wouldn't make it through the night. She paused, her gaze locking with Jalen's. He felt a strange pull, a sense of anticipation thrumming beneath his skin. There was a boy there, maybe 15 years old. He saw us, saw how cold we were. He had this bright blue jacket. It was worn, patched in places, but it looked so warm. Margot's voice softened, a hint of wonder in its tone. He took it off and gave it to us. Just gave it to us. Jalen's breath hitched. A memory, faint and fragmented, stirred in the back of his mind. A blue jacket, his grandfather's favorite jacket, the one he always wore, even when it was threadbare and faded. He told us his name was Devin, and his brother's name was Reynard. Reynard, his grandfather's name, Reynard Brooks. The pieces clicked into place, sharp and sudden, like a lock tumbling open. He stared at Margot, his heart pounding against his ribs. This woman he'd saved, had been saved by his grandfather years ago in a different lifetime. The world tilted on its axis, the sterile hospital room blurring around the edges. My grandfather, Jalen whispered, the words barely audible, even to himself. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a strange mix of grief and pride swelling in his chest. His grandfather, who had died before Jalen was even born, had touched this woman's life, had offered her warmth and kindness in the midst of her despair. And now, years later, Jalen had done the same for her. It was as if a circle had been completed, a debt repaid across the span of time. He looked at Margot, saw the tears glistening in her eyes, and understood. They were connected, bound by a shared history, a silent promise passed down through generations. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood that had clung to her just hours ago. Sunlight, diffused through the blinds, cast striped patterns across the crisp white sheets. Margot Siver lay in the hospital bed, her body a tapestry of aches and bruises. Each breath, though shallow, was a victory. She had survived, but survival felt strangely hollow, a victory stripped of its fanfare. Her gaze drifted to the vase of lilies on the bedside table, their perfume a suffocating sweetness. They were a stark reminder of a life she had lost, the life she had destroyed. A soft knock preceded the gentle creak of the door. Jalen stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a small, worn teddy bear. He looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile. His eyes, usually bright and curious, were now clouded with a weariness that seemed too heavy for a boy his age. Margot's chest ached. She knew that weariness. It was the weight of the world pressing down, the burden of responsibilities that should never fall on such young shoulders. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice raspy. The words felt inadequate, a paltry offering against the enormity of what he had done for her. He shuffled closer, his gaze fixed on the bear. "Mama said you might like this." He extended the toy towards her, his hand trembling slightly. Margot reached out, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent a strange jolt through her, a flicker of warmth in the desolate landscape of her soul. "Thank you, Jalen," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The simple act of accepting the bear felt symbolic, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond woven from violence and vulnerability. He perched on the edge of the chair beside her bed, still clutching the bear's ear. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Margot watched him, her mind racing. How could she ever repay him? Money felt insufficient, a vulgar gesture against the pureness of his courage. She had spent her life chasing wealth, power, the fleeting illusion of control. And now, stripped bare of all those trappings, she finally understood their worthlessness. "Jalen," she began, her voice catching in her throat, I owe you more than I can ever say." Her eyes stung with tears, not tears of self-pity, but tears of a profound and unexpected gratitude. He looked up, his eyes wide and questioning. "You don't owe me nothing," he mumbled, his gaze dropping back to the bear. "Yes, I do," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Your grandfather Reynard, he saved me once. A long time ago." The words tumbled out, a confession she hadn't intended to make, a secret she had guarded for years. He shifted in his chair, his curiosity piqued. "Saved you?" She nodded, the memory washing over her, vivid and bittersweet. She saw herself, a young girl, homeless and hungry, huddled in the doorway of the Tinsley shelter. Reynard, the shelter's caretaker, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, offering her a warm meal and a place to sleep. The memory was a lifeline, a reminder of the inherent goodness that still existed in the world, a goodness she had almost forgotten. "He gave me a place to stay, food to eat, hope when I had none," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. He saw something in me, something I didn't even see in myself." The thought twisted in her gut, a sharp pang of regret. She had betrayed that hope, squandered the second chance he had given her. Jalen listened intently, his eyes fixed on her face, absorbing every word. He seemed to understand, on some deeper level, the significance of the story. He understood the weight of legacy, the ripple effect of kindness. "The shelter had closed down a few years ago," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "Mama said it was 'cause they ran out of money." Margot's heart clenched. The Tinsley shelter. Reynard's legacy. Lost. Just like everything else she had valued. But suddenly, an idea sparked in her mind, a flicker of hope in the darkness. A way to repay her debt. A way to honor the man who had given her everything. "I bought it yesterday," she blurted out, the words rushing from her lips before she could second-guess herself. Jalen's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Bought the shelter?" She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm reopening it." The words felt solid, a promise not just to Jalen, but to herself, to the memory of Reynard. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "But why?" "Because," she said, her voice firm with newfound resolve, "it's the right thing to do." She paused, taking a deep breath, letting the words sink in. "And because it's going to be called the Reynard Brooks Center for Youth and Families." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Jalen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his lips trembling as he tried to form words. Margot reached out and gently squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the shared understanding that passed between them. In that moment, in the sterile confines of a hospital room, a new chapter began. A chapter of hope, of redemption, of a legacy reborn. The lilies on the bedside table seemed to glow a little brighter, their perfume no longer suffocating, but a subtle reminder of the enduring power of kindness. The crisp October air, scented with the faint sweetness of decaying leaves, swirled around Jalen's ankles as he stood awkwardly near the entrance. He tugged at the collar of his new shirt, the stiff fabric unfamiliar against his skin. 2 months. It had only been 2 months since that night, the night that had cleaved his life in two, leaving one half buried in the familiar dust of their hardscrabble existence, and the other shimmering, uncertain, under this autumn sun. The Tinsley shelter, once a grim, gray monolith of peeling paint and broken windows, was now unrecognizable. Fresh cream-colored paint gleamed, the large windows sparkled, and a newly paved walkway led to the entrance, lined with vibrant marigolds bravely facing the coming frost. A large, polished brass plaque beside the door caught the light. The Reynard Brooks Center for Youth and Community, it declared. His grandfather's name. A name Jalen rarely heard spoken anymore. A name that had faded into the soft whispers of memory. Now, it was etched in brass, permanent, a testament to a kindness Jalen hadn't even known existed. He glanced sideways at his mama, her hand resting warmly on his shoulder. He could feel the tremor in her fingers, the same nervous energy that thrummed beneath his own skin. He saw the pride in her eyes, warring with a flicker of something else, something that looked a lot like disbelief. He knew she still couldn't quite comprehend how a single act, a split-second decision born of fear and instinct, could have led to this. He couldn't quite grasp it either. The memory of that night, the metallic tang of blood in the air, The chilling glint of the knife, the weight of the brick in his hand, it all felt like a fractured dream. A dream that had somehow, impossibly, reshaped their reality. The murmur of the growing crowd pressed in on him. Important-looking people in suits and dresses, their voices a low hum of polite conversation, filled the space before the building. Reporters with cameras and microphones jostled for position. Jalen shrunk back, wanting to disappear into the crisp autumn air, to become invisible against the backdrop of turning leaves. He'd never been comfortable with attention, always preferring the quiet corners, the unnoticed spaces. He wasn't used to being seen. "It's all right, baby," his mama whispered, her voice a warm anchor in the sea of unfamiliar faces. "You did good, Jalen. Real good." He swallowed, the lump in his throat stubbornly refusing to budge. He didn't feel good. He felt exposed, as if the spotlight shining on the newly renovated building was also shining on him, illuminating the cracks and flaws he'd always tried to keep hidden. A woman detached herself from the crowd and approached them. Elegant in a simple gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, she moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to hush the air around her. Jalen recognized her immediately. Margot Siver, the woman he had saved. Or, perhaps more accurately, the woman who had saved him. "Jalen," she said, her voice soft but firm, "it's good to see you." Her gaze held his, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition that went beyond the events of that night. It was as if she saw not just the boy who had helped her, but also the boy who carried the weight of his circumstances, the boy who craved the quiet solace of invisibility. He mumbled a greeting, his voice barely above a whisper. His mama, however, stepped forward, her hand gripping his shoulder, tightening slightly. "Miss Siver," she said, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and awe. All of this, we just don't know how to thank you." Margot Siver smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and softened the sharp angles of her face. "You don't need to thank me," she said, her gaze shifting back to Jalen. "Jalen's grandfather, Reynard, he showed me kindness once a long time ago when I had nothing. This is just returning the favor." Jalen's mind reeled. His grandfather? Kindness? The pieces of the story Margot had told him that night in the hospital, fragmented and disjointed, began to fall into place. He had known his grandfather had been a good man, but he hadn't realized the extent of his quiet generosity, the ripples of kindness that had extended across years, touching lives he'd never known. He felt a strange mix of pride and sadness, a longing for a past he could never fully grasp. The formal ceremony began, a blur of speeches and ribbon-cutting. Jalen stood beside his mama, trying to absorb the words, the meaning behind the celebration. He heard phrases like community spirit and second chances and the power of one. But the words that resonated most deeply, the words that seemed to echo in the quiet chambers of his heart, were Margot's. "No child is invisible," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that no act of good goes unnoticed later." After the crowd had thinned, after the cameras had been packed away, a young boy, no older than 8, approached Jalen. He stared at him with wide, curious eyes, a mixture of shyness and admiration in his gaze. "You the one who helped build this place?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jalen looked down at the boy, at the worn sneakers and the slightly too big jacket. He saw a reflection of himself, a younger version navigating the same uncertain terrain. He saw the hope flickering in the boy's eyes, the same hope that had been rekindled within his own heart. He took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. He straightened his shoulders, the unfamiliar stiffness of the new shirt no longer a source of discomfort, but a reminder of the change that had taken root, the change that had blossomed from a single act of courage, a single act of kindness, echoing across generations. "Yeah," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "Yeah, I guess I am." The aroma of fried chicken, a rare luxury, still lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of the afternoon celebration. Jalen sat on the edge of his worn sofa, the cheap cushions sinking beneath him like tired sighs. The vibrant echoes of laughter and music from the grand opening of the Devon Brooks Youth Center seemed to mock the quiet stillness of his small living room. His mama hummed softly in the kitchen, the rhythmic clinking of dishes a familiar lullaby. He clutched a small, leather-bound notebook in his hands, its worn cover smooth against his calloused fingertips. It was Devon's notebook, Margot Siver had called it, a relic from a life Jalen could only imagine, a life filled with dreams of inventions and a future brimming with potential. His grandfather, a man he barely knew, a ghost in family whispers, now immortalized in brick and mortar, a beacon of hope for kids just like him. He traced the embossed initials on the cover, DB, a tangible link to the past, a past that felt both impossibly distant and intimately close. He'd barely spoken to Ms. Siver after the ceremony. The crowd, a mix of neighborhood families and city officials, had swarmed her, their voices a cacophony of congratulations and gratitude. She looked different today, not like the frightened woman huddled in the alley, her eyes wide with terror. Today, she'd held herself tall, her shoulders squared, a faint smile playing on her lips. He'd seen a flicker of something else in her eyes, too, something that mirrored the quiet sadness in his own. A shared understanding, perhaps, of burdens carried and battles fought in silence. "You all right, baby?" Mama's voice, soft and warm, broke through his reverie. She placed a glass of sweet tea on the rickety coffee table, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a moment. He nodded, his throat tight, just thinking. She sat beside him, the springs of the old sofa groaning in protest. "About the center? About Grandpa Devon," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the notebook. "About everything." Mama sighed, a long, weary sound that spoke of years of hardship and resilience. "Your grandpa was a good man, Jalen. Kind, always willing to lend a hand." Her voice cracked slightly. "He'd be so proud of you." Pride. The word felt foreign, uncomfortable. He'd only done what felt right, what he hoped anyone would do. He hadn't thought about pride or reward. He hadn't even thought about the consequences. He just acted. He still saw the flash of metal, felt the cold dread grip his heart as the men lunged towards Ms. Siver. The primal fear, the adrenaline-fueled instinct to protect, to survive. "Miss Siver gave me this," he said, finally lifting his gaze to meet his mother's. Mama took the notebook, her fingers gently tracing the worn leather. "She told me about your grandpa, about how he helped her when she was just a girl." A small smile touched her lips. "Seems like kindness has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? Kindness." The word echoed in Jalen's mind. He thought about the crumpled bills in his pocket, the money he'd earned collecting cans, money meant to help his mama. He'd given it to Ms. Siver that night. A small gesture, a desperate attempt to offer some comfort in the face of her fear. He'd never imagined it would lead to this, to a youth center bearing his grandfather's name, to a future he'd never dared to dream of. A gentle tap on the window startled him. Miss Siver stood on their porch, a hesitant smile on her face. She held a large envelope in her hand. Mama opened the door, her surprise evident. "Tu just wanted to give this to Jalen personally," Miss Siver said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I know it's not much, but—" She handed the envelope to Jalen. Inside, nestled among official-looking papers, was a scholarship certificate to a prestigious boarding school. His breath hitched. Boarding school, a world away from their cramped apartment, from the struggles and uncertainties of their daily lives. A world of opportunity, of possibilities he'd only glimpsed in books and movies. "It sits for Devon Brooks' grandson," Miss Siver explained, her eyes meeting his. "A full scholarship. Tuition, room and board, everything." He stared at the certificate, the words blurring before his eyes. He couldn't speak. His mind raced, a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of hope. Miss Siver knelt down, her gaze level with his. "Your grandfather's kindness changed my life, Jalen. He gave me hope when I had none. I want to do the same for you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "And Jalen, keep your heart no matter what this world throws at you." Her words resonated deep within him, a powerful echo of his grandfather's legacy. He looked at the notebook in his lap, then back at Ms. Siver, a silent understanding passing between them. He finally found his voice, a whisper barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. "Thank you." As Ms. Siver walked away, her figure disappearing into the twilight, Jalen clutched the scholarship certificate and Devin's notebook to his chest. He felt a shift within him, a subtle but profound change. The weight of the past, the burden of poverty, still lingered, but now, a tiny spark of hope flickered within him, a fragile flame ignited by an unexpected act of kindness, a flame he knew he had to protect, to nurture, to let it grow into something bright and strong. He looked at his mama, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He knew, in that moment, that everything would be all right. He knew that even in the darkest of alleys, kindness could bloom, and that sometimes the smallest of acts could ripple outwards, changing lives in ways we could never imagine.